I am today announcing my candidacy for the presidency of the United States.
The most important words of my life.
I'm here tonight.
I stand
before you today
to declare that I am a candidate
for President of the United States of America.
I am running
for President of the United States.
I officially announce my candidacy.
President of the United States.
I'm running for president.
I am officially running
for President of the United States.
From the University of Virginia Center for Politics, this is Sabato's Crystal Ball, America Votes.
Welcome, everyone, to the 5th edition of the Crystal Ball video webinar. We're enjoying these. We hope you are too. We're making just one change. We're going to be sharper and crisper and shorter. And we've gotten those directions from you, our viewers, our audience. We listen to our audience. Politicians say that, we mean it. And so without further ado, let me turn this over to the Crystal Ball managing editor, Kyle Condon.
Thanks, Larry. We're also joined today by the third member of our Crystal Ball team, Miles Coleman. We'll be bringing Miles in a few minutes. So it is Thursday, September 17th. We're recording this in the late morning. First presidential debate is less than 2 weeks away, and we're planning on devoting next week's show to the debates. So if you have questions about the debates you'd like us to address in next week's show, just email us at goodpolitics@virginia.edu. Goodpolitics, one word, @virginia.edu. Later on today, I will be speaking with Sean Trendy, who's the senior elections analyst at Real Clear Politics. We'll be talking about the state of play in the electorally vital Midwest, and also talking about some observations he's made about the polling in that very important region. If this is your first time viewing our program today, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's UVA CFP. Just hit that subscribe button, UVA CFP. We also are releasing this as a podcast, and it is now available on many of the major podcast services like Apple and Spotify and many others. Just search for us there and subscribe. Our new 3-part documentary series on the challenges facing democracy, both in the United States and abroad, Dismantling Democracy, is now available for streaming online at pbs.org. Just search for Dismantling Democracy. And that series is also going to be available on Amazon Prime starting about the middle of October. So look for it there as well if you want to watch it. One of the unfortunate side effects of the pandemic is that many states are still looking for poll workers. And poll workers often are older Americans who unfortunately are most at risk of COVID-19. UVA Alumni Association is encouraging young UVA alums to volunteer as poll workers. If you're interested, visit www.powerthepolls.org/UVA, powerthepolls.org/UVA for more information. And Center for Politics also has a lot of information at our website, centerforpolitics.org. There's a vote tab in the upper right-hand corner, information about being a poll worker, registering to vote, etc. So please take advantage of those resources. And finally, if you'd like to support this program and other work of the Center for Politics, just text USA Votes to 41444, USA Votes to 41444. And we appreciate some of you who have already done that. So with that, let's get into the program. This morning, we published a forecast of the presidential election by Jim Campbell, a longtime election forecaster. We've also featured Alan Abramowitz, Crystal Ball senior columnist, who was also a very prominent election forecaster. Both Campbell and Abramowitz came to sort of different conclusions about the election. Alan sees Joe Biden as sort of more of a favorite. Campbell sees it as kind of a coin flip, even in the popular vote. And one of the things both of them have had to reckon with is what to do with the state of the economy, because one of the predictors for their models is that second quarter GDP growth is always really important, and second quarter GDP growth was historically horrible, and yet the president's numbers on the economy are still pretty decent. So first question to Larry is, what do you do with the economy in an election year like this, where it's clearly bad, but it's also probably going to get a lot better? So what do you think?
Well, 3 words: we don't know. And that's why your crystal ball is being more cautious than certainly we were in 2016. Many others were in 2016, and frankly, more cautious than some are being this year. This is an unprecedented presidential election. We have never had a presidential election during a pandemic. We've never had a presidential election with a decline in the economy this severe, although it does appear to be recovering to a certain degree, maybe faster than some economists had expected. And there are other elements that are unprecedented. Probably Donald Trump all by himself qualifies as an unprecedented element of the campaign. So what I've derived from Jim and Alan's models, and they're among the best in political science. We often publish a dozen or more models during the course of a presidential election year to give everybody a fair shot at predicting the election. They're very, very good. They've been close on most occasions, sometimes right on the button. But the fact that they would end up so differently in the outlook, Alan believing that Biden will win fairly handily, Jim projecting a close popular vote, which to me says that Trump will win the Electoral College in all probability. The fact that these two very able political scientists could produce results so different should suggest to all of us that while we love to jump to conclusions and we love to fill in and color a map and not leave any states out, we really ought to express just a little bit of humility and be ready to accept the fact that some of the things we thought were certain will turn out not to be certain at all.
Yeah, I mean, if you told us it maybe, a year or two ago that the economy would be contracting by 30% or something in the second quarter, you would think that the incumbent president would be a goner in that situation. And maybe that will be ultimately how it is. But I don't think we know that for sure. And the president's numbers continue to be better on the economy than they are overall. The president's overall approval is low to mid 40s, disapproval a bit over 50. Very consistent story for this president. Larry, do you think that's good enough to get reelected?
Barely. It is good enough for this reason, two reasons really. The first is you have to add a couple of points for the Democrat to win simply because of the Electoral College. We already know it's about 2 from Hillary Clinton, could be 3 or 4 depending on how the votes fall. And then you still have a fraction in there. Is it a percent? Is it 2? You can argue it forever, of Trump voters. People are going to vote for Trump who insist upon saying they're undecided because they don't want to start arguments at home, in their workplace, with their neighbors. And so you look at these numbers, you look at Trump's approval rating, and you wonder if that is really more of a floor than a ceiling. Now, he's not going to go over 46, 47%. I think that we can fairly say too. So it's somewhere in that very narrow range. And really, have we ever had this situation where the president's approval and reelect percentage has such a low ceiling and such a high floor? Nothing affects it. For 4 years, we've been looking at the same numbers, more or less.
Yeah, it is amazing that we've gone through this pandemic and the economy and everything. And, the numbers are a little bit different from before the pandemic in terms of how Biden is doing against Trump and what the president's approval is, but they're not that much different. I mean, it's a little bit worse for Trump, but not really that much. If in fact Jim Campbell's model's right and the popular vote is really, really close, that does raise the possibility that we could have a 269 tie in the Electoral College. So both candidates would be one vote short of a majority in the Electoral College. And we wrote this week about something we've been keeping track of, which is who would have the advantage in that. And if we could, we've got a map to show how this dynamic would work. And so the U.S. House would determine who the next president is, the newly elected U.S. House. And you think, oh, well, the Democrats have the majority, therefore the Democrats would be able to elect Joe Biden in the House as the president. The Senate would pick the vice president. But the way the vote actually works in the House is that each of the 50 state delegations, the District of Columbia has electoral votes, but it's left out. But each of the 50 state delegations would have a single vote. So Wyoming gets the same vote that California does, even though California's got 53 House seats and Wyoming's only got 1. And presumably they would all vote based on who controls the delegations. And so the map we just showed shows that the Republicans have a bare majority of the House delegations with 26. The Democrats have 23. And there's one that's evenly matched, and that's Pennsylvania. And so our belief is that the Republicans would have an advantage in this environment. Larry, how do you think the country would react if something like this actually happened?
Well, I think the sane part of the country would take to their basements and not come out. And the more insane parts of the country would be out on the street with weapons and I don't even think about it. This is a provision we should have reformed decades ago, a century ago. It was perfectly designed for the 1790s. It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever in 2020. It didn't make any sense in the 20th century either. So I'm very worried about it. I hope it never happens. The odds are it won't. 69 to 269, but at some point in the future, whether it's 2020 or 3020, it's going to happen, and Americans will not know about this provision. They'll learn about it for the first time and go, "What's that doing in there?" And they should have been focused on it long before it actually happened.
I want to bring Miles in here real quick. We've done these ratings of all the different House delegations, and there are actually two Republican-held ones that kind of stand out as ones that have just a single member and could hypothetically flip in this election. Which ones are those, Miles?
Yeah, like if you look at, say, the Democrats have always tried to make a play at that single Montana seat. That could be kind of a dark horse. If you look at a state like Alaska as well, which is a single seat, there's been some indications that their Congressman Don Youngs may have a bit harder time than they had this year. They're a Republican in Alaska. So those may be two to watch.
Yeah, and Don Young actually is the longest serving member of the U.S. House, the Dean of the House, and he's in his mid 80s. There's always a lot of buzz about whether he'll lose or not. He's always held on, but that's one to watch. And those delegations would flip to the Democrats with a single loss by the Republicans. So that's something to watch. I want to feature a couple of polls. Obviously there's like a fire hose of polls coming out every day, which of course is good for us as we're trying to analyze things. But instead of focusing on the presidential, Quinnipiac had a few polls of some key Senate races yesterday. One of them was in Maine that showed Democrat Sarah Gideon way ahead. They had South Carolina, of all states, tied in their Senate race. They also had Mitch McConnell leading in Kentucky. Larry, any reaction to that? And what's your thoughts on the race for the Senate right now?
Well, I think you give an edge to the Democrats, at least to get to 50-50, maybe 51-49, but that assumes that Joe Biden maintains a lead, a clear lead in the popular vote over Donald Trump. And that's an assumption that may be challenged as we get into the debates and have the October surprises, plural, and all the rest that's still to come before November 3rd. Personally, I think Maine, it's pretty clear that Susan Collins is in trouble there. That poll may be exaggerated, but I think that Susan Collins is in trouble. I have a hard time believing the South Carolina numbers. That state is still very likely to go to Trump by at least a few points, if not more than a few points. And that probably will be enough to drag Lindsey Graham over the finish line. And then Kentucky, I think we're the only ratings group that has never, in the past several elections, had that seat going anywhere but Mitch McConnell. We've never had it a toss-up. I don't think we've even had it lean. Mitch McConnell has a hold on that seat in a very conservative state that Trump is going to carry easily.
One other wrinkle about the main race that I think maybe doesn't get brought up enough is that, so they have ranked choice voting now, which actually allowed Democrats to win a House seat up there in 2018, in that Jared Golden was challenging the Republican Bruce Poliquin. Poliquin was up by about a point in the first round of voting, but then when the second and third place votes got allocated, Golden ended up winning the seat. And that's going to be true for the Senate race too. There is effectively kind of like a liberal Green Party candidate who's been getting some support in the polls. There's also kind of a conservative alternative to Collins. And so probably because there are, four candidates beyond the two major party candidates and two independent candidates, that's probably going to go to this ranked choice voting. But I think Larry's right in that the trend line for Collins in that race, I don't think has been particularly good. Miles, you noticed something about some other polls that came out specifically from AARP, just about the trend line. What did you find there?
Yeah, so there was an AARP poll that was out last week, and from what I understand from the methodology, they oversampled older voters, which makes sense because it's the AARP, but they kind of weighted things based on what the electorate is, and they found it was the result was getting up a point. There was another AARP poll from a little over a year ago, and Collins was up by something like 17 points. So you may say, okay, well, the race now looks like pretty much a toss-up, but that's, as we were saying, that trend line's not great, and they're really they're prioritizing in the poll the voters who are older, have known Collins the longest, who have keep voting to reelect her. So that's just probably not a good trend line for her.
Yeah, I mean, it's sometimes useful to kind of look at not just the polls now, but sort of where they were from the same from the same sponsor, and you do see that Collins started as a big leader, as of course she's the incumbent. You would expect. Sarah Gideon wasn't even the nominee back then, but again, I think just the direction of that race has been sort of problematic for Collins. We're going to get to Sean Trinity in a little bit, but we wanted to also address some reader questions that you all submitted. First one is from Tom Cookson, UVA grad in Miami. This is an important, albeit I would say sobering question, and that is, I found it amazing that so many people have raised the possibility of violent reactions to the election, regardless of who wins. Is this just campaign rhetoric, hopefully, or does it raise fears that some people out there might actually act upon it? Larry, what do you think?
Oh, I think it's pretty clear that the fears are real and at least in some cases justified. And Tom, whatever you've seen in the public press or from political figures is amplified privately when people are discussing it with good friends in politics or those who have the responsibility of running or running the elections. This is something that people are concerned about. Now, let's hope it doesn't happen. I fear it will. I hope it won't. And that's where we are right now. But keep your eyes open.
So a couple kind of related questions here. First one from Zach Kitchery from Gaithersburg, Maryland. What more can Biden do to create a wedge between Trump and his core of white, non-college educated male voters? On what topic for this constituency does Trump have vulnerabilities? And then along the same lines, Martha Ellett from Alexandria, Virginia. Republicans say they want to appeal to suburban women voters. Are there ways for Trump to sort of reach out to that demographic that really has been pretty weak for him? Larry, what do you think?
Well, on the Biden appealing to some of the blue collar workers who are clearly for Trump, it may be a done deal. We've seen that all along. People don't change sides. But the one thing that Biden simply has to do is to talk about the economy more. He's not going to have the edge on Trump on the economy for lots of reasons, good and bad. But what he can do is reduce the gap. He needs to have that be a wash, and it's not close to a wash right now. Trump is getting credit for those first 3 good years of his term with the economy. But, Biden has always been a bread and butter Democratic politician from Delaware, and he'd like to say Pennsylvania as well. So I would expect he can do it, but he needs to get out and campaign more fundamentally. And then he needs to campaign about the economy more while he's out. Don't just talk about the pandemic, even though it's your number one issue. Work the economy in too. As far as Trump reaching out to suburban women, I think that cake is pretty much baked too. Again, what Trump could do is try to reduce the enormous edge that Biden now has with suburban women, women of all colors, not just blacks and Hispanic women or Asian American women. Trump has lost a lot of support among white women in the suburbs. So you can always reduce that edge. Trump is not going to eliminate it. Biden will carry white women in the suburbs almost certainly.
I would say one thing.
Go ahead, Miles. Sure.
I would say one kind of thing on that is one kind of take that's aged well. I've seen that this year is I remember on Twitter several months ago, one of our friends, Liam Donovan, during the primary, he said something to the effect of, okay, well, Biden may be less of a candidate to win back those Obama to Trump voters, most of which have already flipped. But he may be more of a safe harbor for those soft Republicans, those formerly Mitt Romney voters who shifted over to Clinton. So I think that's something that we could see holding up well.
Yeah, and to that point, certainly in the primary season, we saw this turnout surge. I think particularly in some kind of affluent, kind of lapsed Republican suburban areas. And one of the things you see consistently in like House district polling, for instance, that sometimes get released publicly or that we hear about, is that across the Midwest and also across the Sun Belt, that Trump is really struggling in suburban seats, even places where he did pretty well in 2016. And so that's really something to keep in mind here. Question from Mike Ward from Manassas, Virginia. Do we think that mail-in voting will significantly impact who wins the general election at all levels? Larry, any thoughts on that?
Well, obviously the turnout is critical, and if you can increase turnout in either party using mail-in ballots, then you'll do it. The Republicans are trying to do that in Florida, despite all of the, ridiculous comments that Trump has made about voter fraud. And I want people to know, many of us, and I'm one of them, have looked into vote fraud for decades. And there are certainly isolated examples, but it's just not there. This is made up. It is a fiction, and you need to accept that. And if you won't, that's your business, but you're wrong. Now, as far as mail-in is concerned, since Democrats are apparently heavily moving in the mail-in direction, it's pretty clear that if Democrats can increase their turnout using the easier method of mailing in your vote, that's going to help them in some critical states. So the Republicans are trying in some states to use mail-in. In other states, I think they're just giving in to the Trump view. Overall, I would expect the emphasis on mail-in voting to help Democrats in most of the competitive swing states. Maybe not Florida, but certainly other states.
There is a lot of data that suggests that, just from like a modeling of who's requesting mail ballots in places or in states that have party registration, that it's really tilted very heavily to the Democrats across many of these key states. Now, what I think that probably suggests in some ways, to your point, Larry, about the president's rhetoric, is that we're probably just going to see a real big divide between many more Republicans voting on election day and many more Democrats voting by mail. And that could have real consequences. This is something we plan to talk about a lot between now and the election, is that you may see a real difference between Democrats dominating mail-in votes and Republicans dominating in-person votes. And that may show up in the results and be skewed one way or another, depending on what gets counted first. So that's—
And I would say kind of as it already is, if you look at a state like North Carolina, back in 2016, it was fairly close overall. If you looked at the vote that was cast before Election Day, some of it was in person, but it was still early. Clinton would have won the early vote in North Carolina by about 2 points. But if you look at what was cast on Election Day, it was something like Trump plus 16. So already we have these pretty big differences.
That's absolutely right.
No, I was going to say, Miles is absolutely correct. And the other interesting thing is, when you put all your chips on Election Day, you are taking a risk. Suppose there's a spike up days before Election Day in the virus, and older voters are much more inclined to vote in person on Election Day, then your turnout's going to be decreased. Suppose there's a major weather event in a key swing state, and Republicans have been waiting until Election Day when the weather is very severe and it's difficult for many people to get out. With mail-in voting, you have a period of days or weeks or a month to vote. So it's much easier and more predictable to vote by mail. So it's perfectly okay to stress Election Day voting, but you are taking a chance.
Yeah, one of the things that sometimes gets cited about mail-in voting is that there can be a higher rejection rate for the ballots because someone doesn't sign their name right or they stuff the envelope wrong or whatever. So we will know something about that, and maybe that hurts Democrats on the margins. However, to Larry's point, we're not going to know if some small percentage but important percentage of Republican voters who plan to vote on election day actually don't go and vote because there's a rainstorm or because the lines are long or whatever. So there are kind of risks politically on both ends of the spectrum. With that, I think that's a good point to close, and we will and to transition to the second part of our program, which is my interview with Sean Trinity of Real Clear Politics. And again, we're going to be back next week. We're going to be talking about the debates in next week's program. And so again, if you have questions about the debates, things you'd like for us to address, just shoot us an email at goodpolitics@virginia.edu. And so with that, here's my interview with Sean Trinity. Okay, so pleased to be joined by Sean Trinity of Real Clear Politics. Sean, I think, is one of the brightest minds covering elections today, so we're really pleased to have him with us. We're going to talk about the Midwest today, which is where I'm from and where Sean lives now. So Sean, thanks for being with us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So you recently wrote a pretty interesting piece about polling in the Midwest and some of the recent history. What'd you find?
So one of the interesting things about polls in the Midwest is that there's kind of a long-standing problem with them. If you look at the 2014 elections, the 2016 elections, they underestimated Republican vote share pretty substantially. I mean, there's a statistically significant relationship between the size of a state's white without college degree population and its Republican miss. And of course, famously in the Midwest, there's a lot of whites without college degrees. And so after the 2016 kind of debacle in the Midwest, a lot of pollsters went back and said, well, I think we have this figured out now. We're going to start weighting by education, and that should solve the problem. And a lot of people, myself included, kind of took that to heart and said, okay, we don't have to worry about this anymore. Well, it turns out we do have this to worry about anymore. I went back in 2018, just kind of on a hunch to check to see how the polls did in the region, and they were better than 2016, which is a low bar to clear, but the errors were about as big as they were in 2014. So if you remember, we were supposed to have Democratic senators from Indiana and Florida, not in the Midwest, but and Missouri, and we were supposed to have Democratic governors in Ohio. I think Richard Cordray maybe trailed in one poll the entire time. Democratic governors in Iowa, and yet that didn't come to pass. So it looks like a long-standing problem here that I'm not sure has been solved.
Yeah, you noted, of course, that just because there's polling error in a given year doesn't necessarily mean it'll transfer to the future. But it certainly seems very salient, given the Midwest remains kind of the one region that is consistently very competitive in presidential elections. And generally speaking, not always, but usually the presidential winner will win a majority of the Midwestern states. And you do have a lot of polls coming out now that show Joe Biden doing pretty well in the Midwest. And yet, I think what you're suggesting here is maybe we need to stop and wonder a little bit as to how real it is.
Yeah, I don't want people to oversell this, and I think some people on social media have, which, I mean, social media, it's kind of what they do.
Right.
But, I think what's important to remember is that this can happen. You shouldn't take the pollsters' reassurances at face value that they fixed the problem from 2016. If they'd fixed the problem for 2016, we should have had a better 2018 in the region that we did. So I'm not sure if, maybe it was just bad luck in 2018 and 2020 will be just fine. Or maybe the errors in 2020 will look like they did in 2016. I'm just not satisfied one way or the other.
The Trump camp has argued that it can, find and turn out new supporters who didn't vote in 2016. And, several years ago, you wrote what I think turned out to be a very prophetic series of pieces about so-called missing white voters in the Midwest who maybe didn't show up for Mitt Romney, and then it seems like did show up for Donald Trump. Do you think that there may be, first of all, am I characterizing what your theory correctly? And also, do you think that there are more kind of missing white voters to be found for Trump? So, and how plausible is that strategy?
So, when I wrote that piece, I think you summarized it correctly. I looked at turnout in Ohio immediately after the election, noted that it was down in kind of the Southeast and the Appalachian region. And I was struck by a very kind of hard-hitting Obama ad that had run in Ohio, which, had some of the depredations, if you will, of Bain Capital, and end with the tagline, Mitt Romney, he's not one of us. And I thought, if you had that in any other context, like it would be clear that this was meant to kind of turn a group either away from the candidate or just not make it's not worth it to show up. And I think there were a lot of people in Western Pennsylvania, Eastern Ohio, who had decided they didn't much care for Barack Obama, but they didn't want to vote for the guy with car elevators either. And so I said, well, if Republicans were to nominate someone with a little more blue collar credentials, and I was thinking like Scott Walker, or Tim Pawlenty, or John Kasich, maybe they can get some of these voters back. I did not have Donald Trump in mind. But that was the strategy that he ran with, was trying to give something to these voters who kind of felt like they had been ignored by the parties for a while. And I do think it worked in 2016. Can it work again, even more so in 2020? I'm skeptical. I kind of feel like he proved a stronger version of the theory than I had anticipated. I thought, you get these voters in addition to holding Romney's margins with college-educated whites, and then maybe you can. I have a dog barking in the background. I hope that doesn't come on. But
that's okay.
You get Mitt Romney's margin with college-educated whites, and you add on to it some of these missing white voters, and you get a winning coalition. What Trump did was almost ignore the white suburbanites and really go all out for these missing whites. So he proved a stronger version than I thought was possible. I think the lesson for that then is I'm skeptical about 2020, but I'm not dismissive because he's done more than I thought he could. I think there's at least a chance he could do it again.
Sure. Minnesota has been a recent focus of the campaign, in the wake of the killing of George Floyd and protests. The Trump campaign seems to be prioritizing the state, which Hillary Clinton narrowly won in 2016, even more so than maybe a state like Michigan that Trump barely carried in 2016. You wrote about Minnesota recently. What do you think about Minnesota as a Republican target? Do you think that it could maybe shift further toward the Republicans than in like a Michigan or a Wisconsin in this election?
I'm skeptical about Minnesota, and I have been for a while. And the reason is one of the divides we see really opening in politics, besides the racial divide and the education divide, is a geographic divide between rural areas, suburban areas, and then urban areas. And so if you look at a state like Wisconsin or even Michigan, those states aren't dominated by their urban areas. I mean, the urban areas are important, but there's a lot of rural and small town vote cast in Michigan, even small cities, places like Grand Rapids. If you look at Minnesota, Minnesota is more like a Great Plains or Western state. Like Nevada's a city state, right? Like 75% of the vote is cast in Las Vegas, and Arizona is all about Phoenix. Minnesota is more like that than most of the other Midwestern states. It's dominated by the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. There are still a lot of rural votes and small town votes, but it's hard to lose ground in the Minneapolis suburbs to the extent Trump has and still make progress in that state.
Yeah, and you mentioned kind of the other side of this coin. We're talking about kind of Trump's improvements outside of big urban areas, but of course he seems to have lost some ground in the big urban areas and might lose some more. So a lot of the polling, and I would argue that some of the 2016 results, but also some of the results since 2016, I think suggests that Joe Biden probably is going to do better than Hillary Clinton did in a lot of suburban places. You mentioned the suburban Twin Cities, Greater Philadelphia, Greater Detroit, Greater Columbus, other kinds of places. First of all, do you think that is likely, what I'm talking about? And also, do you think that sort of shift by itself would be enough to flip a state like Michigan or Pennsylvania, even if Biden does poorly in the outstate areas, just like Clinton did?
Yeah, I mean, there's a potentially really strong Republican coalition still that merges those rural voters with suburban voters, because that's what kept the Democrats afloat in the Midwest, was strong showings among working class voters. But you need both as a Republican, and so the slippage that we saw in the 2018 midterms, I mean, plain slippage in suburban areas, is something that's really going to, I think, hinder Donald Trump in his quest for reelection. We even saw it in Ohio. Delaware County hasn't voted for a Democratic presidential candidate since 1916. Trump carried it in 2016, but then in the special election we had for Pat Tiberi's old seat, it was close, and then it was close again in 2018. So it's a threat to him.
And then I guess one of the things I think about too a lot is, let's assume that Trump does do worse in, again, Greater Philly, Greater Detroit, Greater Twin Cities, et cetera. I'm thinking, is it possible that for as well as he did in these outstate areas, could he do even better? And I personally don't, I haven't seen any real polling that would back that up, but that would seem to be maybe a necessary part of maybe carrying some of these states again. What are you looking for in some of these places where maybe they went from, voting for Obama to voting for Trump by 15, 20 points? Is there more room to grow there? Or should we expect some erosion for Trump in those places?
I think there is. I mean, one of the problems with whites without college degrees, and it's one of the problems with polling them, frankly, and waiting for them, is that at a certain point you do hit like college students in baristas. It is not possible for Donald Trump to start running among whites without college degrees the way that Joe Biden probably will among African Americans. I do think, though, in the North, the Midwest, there's still some room for growth for Trump. Areas around Duluth, in Minnesota, in Ohio, places like Youngstown and Toledo. There's still some potential for him to make up some of the ground that he's losing in suburban areas. Now, you start to get, again, toward families that have been Democratic for decades, and those loyalties go away hard. But yeah, there's still some room for growth, particularly in this area of the country.
One thing that was striking to me in looking at some of the, not necessarily the exit polls, but some of the kind of higher quality research about like what the actual 2016 electorate looked like, was that in a state like Ohio, and I think this is true in Pennsylvania too, according to some of the studies from like Center for American Progress, Ruth Teixeira, Rob Griffin, some of those folks, they found that basically Clinton didn't really do that much better with whites with a 4-year degree in some of those states, and then obviously she did way worse with white voters who didn't have a 4-year degree. And I'm wondering if maybe, and I'm curious as to what you think about this, if one shoe dropped in 2016 in some of these states that was really good for Trump, and kind of there's another shoe to drop in 2020 in some of the suburban areas in these states that really would be good for the Democrats. Do you think that that's a possibility? I think you do see that sometimes in some of these congressional district polls of these suburban districts.
Yeah, one of my favorite sayings about politics is that political coalitions are like water balloons, right? You step down on one side and another side pops up. And that's kind of what we're seeing we saw it with the Democrats, I think, in 2016, where maybe under Obama, they became a little bit too progressive and shed some of their working class base. But now we see Donald Trump leaning heavily on his, white working class voters. And yeah, I absolutely think there's been shedding of white suburbanites, particularly in kind of the exurbs, places like Delaware County in Ohio, that aren't kind of your traditional core suburbs, but are the fast growth areas of the 2000s and 2010s. I think Trump has suffered some real losses here, and it's the reason, frankly, that he's been sub 50% in his job approval for his entire presidency.
Yeah, there are a number of those kinds of places across the Midwest that I think we'll really be watching. Last question, I guess, if we're a little less than 2 months to the election, the Midwest I think still remains super duper important to this campaign. If you were the Biden campaign and you're looking at these public numbers, and of course the Biden campaign has their own internal numbers that we're not necessarily privy to, but if you were the Biden campaign, how confident would you be in your position in the Midwest at the moment?
I think I'd feel good about it. I don't know that I'd be confident about it. You know, both parties were surprised. You know, we know that campaigns have better polls, but even the campaigns polling failed them in 2016. So I'd be nervous about that. I'd be nervous that President Trump's job approval has gone up about 5 points in the last couple months. He seems to be recovering from where he bottomed out in 2016. So if that trend continues, if he gets up to 46, 47% from the 44, 45 he's at now, you know, he's really competitive. So I think I'd also, if I were Biden, be a little spooked by these stories. You know, in 2016, we got the stories about Clinton, you know, kind of anecdotal stories about Clinton's weakness with white working class voters that turned out to be prophetic. We're getting all these stories about Biden weakness with non-whites and particularly Hispanics. So I'd be a little spooked about that because they are a growing contingency in the Midwest. So I think he has the upper hand. But I don't think he's so dominant that he can feel like really confident and maybe start, you know, looking to rack up the electoral wins in other states, more marginal states just yet.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds pretty reasonable to me. Sean, you can find Sean's work at Real Clear Politics. Sean, is there anything you'd like to plug? Anything you're working on, or things that you put out recently?
Well, you know, I'll always plug my home at Real Clear Politics. That's where you can find the bulk of my writing. I like our methodology for poll averaging. I think we did better than most in 2016, and hopefully we'll do better than most in 2020 as well.
Well, Sean, thanks so much. And, you know, Sean's work is always must read, and he's a must follow on Twitter. So Sean, thank you so much, and look forward to seeing your work for the rest of the campaign here.
Thanks for having me.